So hi there folks, my name's Martin Hoxie. Now hopefully you can hear me okay, and we go from the top, take two. So what I want to talk about today is really to just get you thinking about, well, Twitter essentially and its place within learning, both in personal learning and directed learning, and the footprints that we leave behind on Twitter. We're obviously leaving footprints behind pretty much across the entire web as we're traveling, unless you've got obviously browser plugins that can block cookies, things like that. But even still, people like Facebook are able to track you even if you're not logged in. So there's obviously a dark side to leaving footprints, but I'm interested in looking at the good, the potential good that you can actually do that with that. So, as I mentioned, in particular, I'm going to focus on the footprints we leave on Twitter's and the opportunities that actually brings us for network learning. As part of this, the kind of the main story, which I want to get over as well, is APIs. So you might have heard the term API, not really known too much about it, but I think APIs are going to be a big thing within the way that we actually approach learning and teaching. They already are becoming a huge thing. So APIs are just basically ways that programs and services can actually talk to each other and share pieces of data. And hopefully this talk will highlight some of that for you. So before we do, let's start looking in at Twitter as a platform. And it's quite interesting to, Twitter isn't static as a platform. Twitter are rolling out new features on a daily basis. Well, not perhaps a daily basis, but on a regular basis. So now we've got the kind of new way of retweeting people, which embeds the tweet, which is wonderful, and I'm really struggling to adapt to. But there are also a lot of community-driven developments in Twitter as well, and one in particular is the hashtag. So this wasn't a feature that was in Twitter when it was released. Hashtags were actually a suggestion that came from a guy called Chris Messina, who's worked for Mozilla and Google. And so this is his tweet from 2007, where he suggested, well, how do you feel about using the hashtag or the £sign as a way of tagging stuff so other people can search and find for it? So when Chris originally posted this tweet, now we can go to a tweet and the hashtag is a live link, so we can actually search for stuff. Tools like TweetDeck actually support the idea of searching for hashtags. You could search for hashtags back in the day, but it wasn't really integrated as part of the feature set. So this was 2007 that he came up with that, and you can actually go and see his tweet. It's not special in the fact that Twitter preserved it, but a lot of the data, if people haven't deleted it, it still exists on the Twitter server, so you can actually go and see it. You can actually interact with that tweet as well, so you can still favorite it, you can still retweet it, you can still reply to Chris, and I think that's quite an interesting thought to have, that 8 years is quite a long time when you're thinking about the internet, and the fact that this data is still there, it's still in the system, and we can still interact with it. Just pulling back slightly from Twitter and just thinking about networks in general, I'm sure for a lot of you, you're familiar with the idea of different shapes and types of networks, and this is a diagram that was produced in the 60s, and it was when they were actually considering the design of ARPANET, which is the foundation, one of the foundations of the internet we have today. So this is the how do you connect data centers together in a strong, robust way. And so obviously, with the thought of with nuclear attack, how do you keep a strong network? And obviously they went for C, a distributed network. And this was a network of data centers, but it's interesting to consider this network as a learning network or just an interaction network. So the fact that knowledge, information, skills, people are distributed, but they have connections. And for me, learning is a lot about making those connections. So it's not just connections with people, it's connections with knowledge and skills as well. And I'm obviously not the first person to start, considering learning in this way. And Stephen Downes has done a lot of work in this area. And this was quite a nice graphic that Brian Mavers generated as part of Catherine Cronin's keynote from Alt-C. So, it's putting yourself in that space where you can start interacting with other people and interacting with other information. And that's one of the things with Twitter is that you are leaving these patterns. The data is there, and we can see how conversations that people are having. We can see other interactions people are having. Things that they're favoriting, they're tweeting, and for me, it's having worked with Twitter data for a number of years now. I think there's a lot of latent information within this mass of stuff going on. I appreciate that there's only 140 characters, but there's a lot that you can convey in 140 characters, especially when you can start including things like media as well, and links. So just thinking, I mentioned one of the things that I was quite keen to just highlight was API. So to get to the data within Twitter, we need to use an API, or we can do the kind of web scraping type, just looking for stuff. But Twitter is presented in a very particular way. So you've got a timeline, or you can look for individual tweets. You can see conversations going on. But sometimes we want more than that. So we want a bigger picture. And the way to do this is through APIs. So as I mentioned, APIs are just ways for programs to actually interact with each other. So you can write a piece of code that can go to Twitter and say, give me back a bunch of tweets around a hashtag or a search term, and there's a whole list of other bits of data that you can get out of Twitter in this way. And it's not just Twitter that has this API. There's a lot of other services as well, and this is one of the fundamental things that quite often is hidden from view that is actually there. So if you start actually exploring some of the interactions that are going on behind the scenes when you're surfing through the internet, you can actually see the web pages making calls to data to actually render in the page. And there was one of the people I think is really worth following in this space is a guy called Ken Lane, and he's starting to try and raise awareness just about how much we can actually achieve with APIs within education. I think increasingly as well as there is more data being used within education, there's going to be more need for good and reliable APIs, not just to interact with things like Twitter, but for students to get their own data back out of the institution. So I think there's a lot to do with that. And I gave this talk last week, which went similarly well technically, although hopefully we've recovered from a lot of that. And so this was a tweet that Brian Lamb, who was in the audience, tweeted it. So we're seeing those the resonance happening here. So I presented the slides, Brian was in the room, he was able to tweet an actual paper. So, you know, we can see the connection starting to build. And there's a really nice section within this white paper that you can go and find. So Ken was highlighting the fact that APIs are one of the many web literacies that I think if you start understanding and knowing, not necessarily being a programmer and doing, you know, cool and interesting stuff, but just aware that, you know, this is a way of getting data. I think you can start taking more ownership, and you can make, as Kim says, it, you know, make the internet work for you. So I've talked a bit about API. So let's actually look at what the data looks like from the Twitter API. So I mentioned Chris Messina's hashtag tweet, and we can actually see that. So one of the tools that Twitter offers developers is the ability to actually experiment with their API. So you can, and this is a good way if you've got no programming knowledge, is to actually explore some of the data that's actually there. So if you go to dev.twitter.com, you'll see a whole list of tools, and if you search for their console, you'll get into a page. And what you can actually generate is an API call. So this is the response that a piece of code would get if it made an API call which requested the tweet that Chris made back in 2007. So I'm just going to blow this up a bit. So hopefully, so the way APIs return data varies between servers, but the majority use something which is called a JSON object. So hopefully, even if you don't understand what a JSON object is, you can see the pattern here. So we have a key indicating a element of the data that we're going to get back, and the actual value of that data. So the text, here's Chris's tweet. We've got a ton of other information in here. So we've got when it was created at, we've got the ID of that tweet. If it was in reply to anyone, we've got that information as well. Also within here, we've got the user information, and you'll see it's all broken down into easily readable parts, readable for a machine, probably less readable for you, but there, you know, there's a degree of readability here, hopefully, that you can see. And so, you know, practically everything within that tweet is broken into something that we can read. It might not necessarily be useful, but it's there. So that's an example of the data that we can potentially get back from a tweet. And this is just one tweet, and it goes on. You know, if he was had his location enabled, it would be in the tweet as well. Even things like the time zones he's in. Again, to get varying degrees of usefulness in this, but just to be aware, there's a ton of stuff potentially there which might be useful. And so I'm going to skip over the next one. In fact, let's not. Let's go back a tweet or slide, however you look at it. So, you know, Ken was talking about making the internet work for you. So I'm in the fortunate position where I'm able to code. So the slides you're actually seeing, this deck is generated from tweets. So hopefully you can see from the stream that as I go through my slides, stuff is being pushed out. And that's all done from a Google spreadsheet. And so I don't know any foreign languages, but I can code, and I feel that that's my my sense of well, I can't speak a foreign language, but I can code. I'm a good person in the world. But maybe I'll learn a language one day. So, gaining insights from tweets. I have to say, this is one of the areas where, personally, I think there's a huge amount of work still to be done. But I think one of the foundations is actually getting the data out. But also, I think another part of this is actually not, it's having purpose when you're using Twitter in education as well. And I've referred to this as paths with purpose. So this is the graph that Mark Sample has come up with, looking at just the different modality that you can get from Twitter, from a very passive communication tool to a more discursive tool. And I think the richness that you can potentially get from Twitter, goes from huge extremes. So I recently asked people for examples of how they're using Twitter in education. And so Derek Bruff shared this example of Bird Class, where the professor in this class had, oops, go back one, had asked her class, it's an ornithological class, to actually, when they're out and about, to actually take pictures of birds and reflect. So providing some sort of situational context to their learning, which is then shared to the class and equally shared to the world as well. So when you start building these activities, and as part of this activity, the tutor required people, I think it was 10 tweets in the semester or something like that. You can find out more from that tweet about the class itself. So when you start building learning designs where you're using Twitter over a prolonged period, I think one of the first issues you encounter is that Twitter isn't really designed for the administration of learning. And that's where we have to start working out how we can use the data within Twitter to our benefit to actually help with some of these processes. So just moving quickly on to think about, I've mentioned that there are a number of different APIs within Twitter that you can use, and one of them is the search API. There are some something to bear in mind is when Twitter have obviously made the search API available, so any developer, anyone who has a Twitter account, essentially can sign up and get access to this API. But something to bear in mind is there isn't actually equality between the data Twitter uses internally and the data it exposes via its API. So a good example of this is Twitter search. So if you go to the Twitter website and you put in a search term, you'll get all the results back. So this is quite a recent development, actually. Up until recently, if you went to the website, Twitter's website, and put in a search term, it would be limited to roughly the last 7 days. But they've changed that to you now get everything, potentially everything back for that search term, regardless of time. With the Twitter search API, the restriction is still there of this roughly 7 days. So this is the actual quote from the Twitter developer tools. It's not a complete index. It's and we're back, hopefully. It's probably a good time actually to take a pause. Let's okay, so so hopefully, let me actually make sure. Okay, so I'm just going to go back and just mention this. So this is tags, and this is a slightly modified sheet. So all this is doing is just binning or putting in bins the data and presenting it in a usable way for a particular situation. So as I mentioned, Twitter presents data in a very particular way. So, it's quite often just a timeline of stuff, which can be quite hard, particularly if you're coming to a community fresh, to actually work out where you are within that community, who are the influencers in that community, who might be most helpful for you to connect with. And this was really where I started with all this stuff. Was I was looking at some of the work that Tony Hurst was doing at the Open University around networks and social network analysis. So this is a couple of years ago, and he was generating these graphs, which were actually showing how people were connected within the hashtag community. I can't remember which one this is for. I think it might be the alt conference or something like that. And what I found was, looking at these graphs, one of my immediate reactions was, where was I in this community? How was I connected within here? And that's really where the next tool, which is used as part of tags, comes from. So hopefully you're familiar with Tags Explorer. So this just provides a way of interactively exploring some of the conversations going on Twitter. So I've mentioned LoadXL. This is another tool that does a similar sort of thing. Tags Explorer is, I think, useful because you can, it's a website that you can interactively explore online. So there's a nice quote in that blog post about some of the graphs mean most to the people that generate them. So if you're generating your own graphs or exploring your own graphs, I think there's a lot more power to that. And so that's really where Tags Explorer was born, and there's a lot more you can find out about that. There was a tool, I should say, as well, that I developed a couple of years ago, and I haven't really revisited it. So I don't put it out there as the perfect tool. I think it's interesting to see how people use it. And one day we'll get away from everything being a Death Star, promise. So I mentioned that LoadXL is another tool for this. So again, this is a nice low-level entry tool where you're removing some of the messiness and dealing with APIs, and you're getting data and you can analyze it. And there are lots of other tools. I think Francis Bell, I think, is doing some work taking tags data and putting it into another service called Metalytics. So that allows you to do word analysis. So there's a lot more potentially you can do. And I think one of the nice things about having data into a spreadsheet is you can easily export it and import it into something else. So I've mentioned some of the limitations with Twitter. Another thing, there was this time thing, but another thing that a lot of people don't realize is that when you're using the search API, you're not necessarily going to get all the data back. So there have been some research studies into the completeness of data that you get back. And I think one of the issues with these studies is that Twitter is modifying the way that its data is indexed, how it's connected within its service. So I would take a pinch of salt with some of the older studies. If you come across the newer ones, they're probably more relevant. Personally, I haven't had huge problems with missing data that I'm aware of, but you know, within 10,000 tweets, how do you detect missing tweets? So there are some weird things going on with, for example, you'll see mention of individuals not appearing in search terms, which I don't have an answer for. So it's something to be aware of. So the other thing is, when you're using search terms, is sometimes people go off tag. So not building a complete picture, I don't think is possible. For the starter, you've got the limitations of the Twitter search, but also in people's behavior. So sometimes people don't want to share everything with a hashtag. They'll have breakout discussions, and I think that's something to be aware of. And sometimes those are perhaps some of the richest discussions going on anyway. Other limitations when you're thinking about using Twitter data, there's the ethical question, which I think with Twitter data is a huge gray area, because a lot of the data that you're using is it is public, but there's also legal aspects as well. So, for example, Twitter, when you sign up to use its service, there are a number of terms and conditions in terms of what you can do with the data. One of those terms is, it's quite interesting, that you're permitted to export data into a spreadsheet, but you can't, my understanding of the terms and conditions, is export into other data storage en masse, if at all. So one of the reasons I think tags is a good model is the fact that it's putting data into a spreadsheet. So we're conforming to what Twitter wants. I'm just going to disappear back here for a second. I'll talk about this tool quickly at the end. So now this is probably a good time, while this is churning away, to actually let you peek behind the curtains. So this is a new tool I've developed called Tags Presenter. So within here, I've got basically the text that I want to tweet, and I can see the length of that tweet, and I can also include images. So some of these tweets obviously have embedded media, so they have YouTube. Other ones I wanted to include an actual image for you to see. And so these images are actually stored on Google Drive. And so let me just quickly. So these are the images for some of my slides, and I've just got a reference for them, which that I can then use in the spreadsheet. And so as I go through this front end bit, which is actually connected to the spreadsheet bit, as I go to each one of these slides, it's sending off the tweet. Now, the reason I've paused slightly is to send off media. to Twitter is actually a two-stage process. So the first stage is actually sending the media to Twitter, so the image to Twitter, and that generates an ID. So what I've just done is set a script running, which is going off and collecting the images and posting them to Twitter. Twitter clears out images after 60 minutes. So what's happened is I've started my talk, I've got stuck, and I've restarted at least twice now. And so those images I carefully generated at the beginning have now disappeared from the cache. So I've got a timer on these that lets me know they've run out. So this is where I twiddle my thumbs. Actually, a good point. If you have any questions, I've got a lovely delay on Twitter and Google Hangouts. So not the quickest thing in the world, this, you have to say. So just more about what's going on here. So tags and tags presenter and a lot of my other projects use something called Google Apps Script, which is part of Google Drive. So you can actually do a lot of customization within spreadsheets and documents and forms to get them doing what you want to do. And the really nice thing for me is that you can interact with APIs and reasonably easy. I say reasonably easy, and then people shoot me down because I appreciate coding's not for everyone. But one of the things with some of the work myself and others are doing is trying to make some of that a bit easier. There was an interesting question last week when I was presenting something similar about, how do you actually start with this? And I think one of the key starting points for me was a tool called Yahoo Pipes, which is still available. Yahoo Pipes, basically it's a visual programming tool. So you drag and